This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sir.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show. Today we are at the breakfast table in Trinity College, Dublin, where we've invited novelist Sarah Moss, guest writer at the Carlow Pittsburgh MFA programme, to come along and have a coffee and to chat with us about her new novel, Ripeness, which was published May the 22nd by Picador.
Moving from 1960s Italy to contemporary Ireland, Ripeness is an expansive story of love and the search for home and belonging, of settling and flight, of the body and physicality in all its guises. From the best-selling author of Summer Water, also author of Ghost Wall, which was longlisted for the prestigious Women's Prize.
Yeah, and Sarah is also a gifted writer of memoir. She's written Names for the Sea, an account of her year living in Iceland, and My Good Bright Wolf, which came out last year in 2024. She was born in Glasgow and grew up in the north of England. After moving between Oxford, Canterbury, Reykjavik, West Cornwall and the Midlands, she now lives in Dublin.
Sarah's books have been heaped with praise. Her work is as close to perfect as a novelist can be. One reviewer said, Sarah Moss is one of our greatest living writers. Another said, so Sarah, we're delighted to have you here at the breakfast table.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Great. You're very welcome. Well, Sarah, Ripeness, as Peter said, spans decades, doesn't it? And continents. It goes from Italy in the 60s to modern day Ireland. And we follow the character of Edith as a teenager. She's just finished school and we follow her right up through her life as an older 73-year-old woman who's now living in Clare, Ireland, in what you describe as her later years of sex and friendship. It sounds really good to me. I loved in the opening few pages where we follow the 17-year-old Edith through Europe because she's making her way to Italy to a villa, isn't she, where her older sister Lydia, who's a ballet dancer, is pregnant and she is living there near Lake Como. So Edith's mother, as all good mothers do, says, go on, Edith, off you go. You need to go off and look after Lydia. The mother doesn't go anywhere, but she sends Lydia off. And I was just wondering, would you read a section from that part of Edith's journey?
So this is 17-year-old Edith arriving in Italy, and she's just been on a boat where she's feeling quite awkward because she's still wearing bits of her school uniform because she doesn't have anything else to wear. And now she's finding her way from the ferry terminal to her sister's house. Don't worry, I'll spare you my nostalgically recalled adolescent raptures over the scenery. I'd just ask you to remember that I'd grown up in post-war Derbyshire, that I was accustomed to bomb craters all over the towns and cities of northern England, by then overrun with brambles and morning glory, but sites of explosion nonetheless, that the rain-hammered ruins of aerial bombardment were ordinary, that rationing meant I'd eaten my first orange when my mother brought them back from Israel in her suitcase, peace offering or bribe. And here were trees bright with oranges, and the scent of their blossom heavy as we came into each small harbour. Here were figs, which I knew only dried and chopped in suet puddings, ripening on the trees, lemons weighing down glossy leaves, hillsides silvery with olive groves, when I had only read about olives. Yes, I know, done before, done to death, but like most clichés, there is a reason. I was 17 and hungry in every way. Débarque à Saint-Appendieu, Maman's letter said. She always switched to French for disembarkation. Get off, she said. In English, you are always getting food and clothes and ideas, and on and off. It's a lazy verb. I alighted. I made landfall. I stepped ashore. I had not expected to be met. We were not that sort of family. Daddy, sometimes, if he remembered your train time, if you had told him your train time, and if he could spare the time and petrol, would drive down to the village and wait in the ancient Land Rover, which smelt of manure and dogs. But mostly we stood on our own 2 feet. Even Liddy, tottering up the mucky lane in unsuitable shoes with her smart leather case banging against her perfect calves. I hitched my knapsack. My shoes, polished by Daddy and resoled before I left, had a few miles in them yet. There were pink and red and white geraniums spilling from troughs fixed to the metal railings along the cobbled promenade. Railings as exotic to me as the flowers, since all the municipal metalwork in England had been torn up for munitions in the early days of the war, before I was born, and never replaced. There were trees of uniform heights planted at uniform distances in stone-lined beds in the pavement, and between them wooden benches, freshly painted, unoccupied. I would have liked to sit down a moment, but I would have felt conspicuous, even more conspicuous. There were men sitting at tables in front of what must have been a bar, 3 little boys who stopped playing on the pebble beach to watch me, 2 women also disembarking with baskets and packages from their shopping. Turn right and walk straight through the village, the letter said. The sun was still bright. The air and the breeze seemed dry. Then, as now, I was accustomed to damp. We are half aquatic, we people of the North Atlantic's unnameable archipelago, Ireland and Northern Ireland and the British Isles, the Republic and the North and the disunited kingdom, the smaller island and the bigger one. We have at least a climate in common. We go out in the rain, we breathe the fog. We swim our chilly waters. I heard for the first time the shrilling of cicadas, could not yet stop hearing it. There was always birdsong in England then. The quiet of my adult life was not yet falling, and so the Italian birds were less noticeable than they are to me when I travel now. But there were voices I had not heard before in their chorus, unfamiliar wings on the air. The buildings were all a shade of orange-pink I associated with curtains, somehow louche or feminine or not serious enough for outdoor use, and their deep-set windows had white wooden shutters which I had seen only in pictures. I carried on. The pavement ended with the houses. High walls ran between the dusty road and the hillside. I would climb some of those hills, and I would swim in the lake, which must surely be warm enough. After you leave the village, Maman wrote, take the first turn up the hill and the gate is on your right. Here it was, a large double gate, behind which a gravel drive lined with glossy-leaved pink-flowering bushes curved up daisied grass. Bloody hell, Liddy, I said. Cypress trees towered over the lawns, and I couldn't see the house. I took a deep breath and tried to turn the handle of the gate. Maybe it was just stiff. Maybe I should lift, not turn. But the big keyhole was plain, oiled, in use. I looked again for a bell. Maybe you were supposed to ring. Maybe I was oafish, trying to let myself in. What if it was the wrong house after all? What would they think, some travel-stained foreigner? I walked up the road a bit to see if there was another house, if I could have made a mistake. But there wasn't. At the end of the pink wall there was farmland, cows and then mountainside. I tried the gate again, hurt my finger. Trust sodding Liddy to immure herself like Sleeping Beauty. What was I supposed to do? No mobile phones, of course, in those days. If I'd had a telephone number, I could perhaps have returned to the village and negotiated the use of a telephone, but I didn't. Nor did I have enough money for a hotel, let alone a ticket back to England. I should have to sleep in an olive grove, hitchhike my way back to Derbyshire, starve to death like Jane Eyre on the moor, except I would be surrounded after all by ripe oranges and figs, and I still had my sandwich. I sat down on the grass verge, which I later discovered to have been a mistake, insect bites in places you don't want them, and ate half the sandwich. And then I gave thanks again to Daddy for the knapsack and climbed over the gate. Thank you. Thank you.
And what's going to happen when she gets over that gate? And again, because the way that the novel is structured and with the kind of switching of perspective, we have to wait a bit to find out. But it's such a striking opening. The shy young Edith, as you were saying, in the bits of her kind of school uniform, arriving in Lake Como in Italy on a life-altering mission to support her pregnant sister. I mean, there have been other novels I'm thinking that, have teenage female protagonists. I'm thinking about Dodie Smith's Cassandra in I Capture the Castle, or Bryony in Ian McEwan's Atonement. But I wondered, what inspired you to place such emotional weight and responsibility on a teenage protagonist just in the year before she goes up to Oxford? And I think, because the grown-ups are very much conspicuous by their absence. It's all on Edith's shoulders, and she's so young to be dealing with all of this, isn't she? She says that she came to understand things I didn't particularly want to understand. Even.
I was thinking about that because somebody asked me about my spiritual age, and I wanted to say something very grown up, but I was thinking 17, really. I keep writing 17-year-olds. I did it in Ghostwall as well. I think there's something about that moment on the cusp of adulthood where my kids have just been through it in the last few years. You can really see that in many ways they're totally equipped, and in many ways they're not equipped at all. And I find that transitional stage where you know a lot of things, but you don't have very much experience. And maybe you have a lot of conviction, but not much experience. It's quite intriguing. It's intellectually intriguing, all of that certainty.
I have to say, Sarah, I was really won over by the way you maintain Edith's voice across such a broad time frame. You capture her as a teenager initially, but also she's a reflective, mature woman in rural Ireland. So there's a balancing act going on between the chapters, isn't there? So you've Italy in Ireland, you've past and present, you've Edith as a young girl. She tells her story in the first person, and you use the third person for the chapters when we encounter Edith as an older woman. And of course, you see, there is also the added narrative layer of Edith writing to the you of the baby who was born. So I suppose what I was wondering, did this alternating structure, did it help you to enter the life and the mindset more easily of Edith at different stages in her life and her inner journeying?
I think so. The interesting bit was the decision not to cover any of the middle ground, that we would jump from 17 to 73 and trust that that could carry everything that had happened in between, or as much of what had happened in between as it needed to. So, I mean, that was really the writerly challenge.
Yeah, but I think you were so deft the way you did it. And as a reader, it just was so smooth to read that. So I really enjoyed it.
But I suppose you're constantly aware of like all the stuff that has happened to her because she's 73. And so she keeps reflecting back on her divorce, her life in South Dublin and all of the other kind of South Dublin people that she hung around with. So a lot of the action is kind of happening in the past, and comparing that with the kind of isolation that she's enjoying, because she's on her own, except with her friends, I suppose, in rural County Clare. But another thing that struck me, and again, as it comes up in the other books as well, there's a huge amount of physical activity in the novel. I mean, it's, walking, swimming, dancing, rowing, running, yoga, hyper-awareness of the body in motion. It made me think of the memoir as well, and Summer Water, thinking the life of the body is clearly very important to you. It's kind of like an imaginative trigger in a way.
Yes, but there is no other life. I always find this quite interesting. People say, you're interested in embodiment. And I think, but there is nothing without embodiment. And I think the more we engage with machines and the more we outsource thinking, the more we can imagine that our brain is not part of our body. But the body is, it'll come up later when we're thinking about Wordsworth and Dorothy. Writing is still physical work. It may just be typing with your fingers, but it's also thinking with your brain. And I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling that work slow down if I'm tired or if I'm hungry or if I'm not very well, feeling it speed up if I'm well nourished, well rested, in good health, if it's a good moment for it. So I wouldn't say it's so much that I write about the body as that I write about being alive, and that's being in a body.
So it's like that kind of classic kind of Cartesian thing of the ghost and the machine, or the mind and body as separate things, where you're saying, okay, this is not the case. They're actually it's a unitary kind of thing. And
yes, and also that Cartesian fantasy has a politics, right? We were saying earlier that what you don't get is what gets you, and the more we engage in that fantasy that the mind is just a kind of spirit visiting the body and really not concerned with it, well, that was always racialized, gendered, and classed, because it was always some people's work to look after the body. And I'm so interested in a writing project that reintegrates that insists that writing and care are not enemies. It's the whole pram in the hall is the enemy of promise thing. The pram in the hall is the vessel of promise. The pram in the hall contains the promise of humanity. That's what it's for. That's what we're wheeling around. So I really want to get away from all of that fantasy of disembodiment or purity of mind. I think it's politically very suspect.
We've a teenage daughter who has been dancing since she was about 4. And so I loved the dance in it, because she's off going to see Lydia, her sister, who's a dancer. And there are beautiful descriptions of the dancers, about their business and rehearsing. The dance dances the dancer. Ed says he's one of the dancers. And Lydia, there's this beautiful thing where she dances at the farewell dinner. All the dancers are going back, and Edith and her sister are left in the villa. And Edith is watching her pregnant sister dance. And she says, I had not thought such small movements as she made could command so much space. And I underlined that line. I thought it was so beautiful. Or you talk about the way ballet is passed from muscle to bone. So, were you always interested in dance? This novel as well, I think this is kind of a two-edged question. It comments very much on the nature of art, its resilience, its beauty. So would you like to answer those two questions, Sarah?
Yes, I'm just thinking about which one. I'll go for the easy one first. Yes, I was always interested in dance. I used to dance. My grandmother had a terraced garden, so it was sort of like a stage. It went down in series. And I now recognise what was going on. She was very happy to sit on the bottom terrace and allow me to dance up and down the top. Of course, she could sit still with a cup of tea while the 6-year-old tired herself out. I mean, who wouldn't be ecstatic at that? But she did it beautifully. She made it seem that she was delighting in watching me. And then I did ballet, which was disastrous. My ballet career was over by the time I was 8. I still can't do left and right. It's a problem with yoga. And I just don't have that kind of body, and I never did, which is a bit brutal as a discovery when you're 8, but useful. And I remained interested in watching it. As an art form, I find this is the first time I've written about it. And I think the relationships between dance and time and writing and time are so fascinatingly different. I mean, dance exists only in the moment of performance. It's innately transient. There's no notation of dance. It's taught from one dancer to another dancer. And of course, now it's all filmed and you can learn a bit from that. But really, it's a practice that passes from body to body. Whereas writing is a technology of memory, it's written almost in resistance to transience and death. It's about existing in places where you are not and in times where you are not. And then there's also a thought about pottery in this book, because 70-year-old Edith Lover Gunter is a potter.
I like Gunter. Gunter is lovely.
I like Gunter. Yeah, he's fine.
Sarah said that at the beginning of the novel, she said earlier, she couldn't read that bit, but it's...
Oh, I totally can.
When I say it's the beginning, it's not quite, because we do have Edith with Gunter in the bed at the beginning, which is very interesting. I know I'm going off track here now, but was that Joyce?
Begins with yes and ends with yes.
Of course, yeah, it was lovely to have that connection, yeah. But anyway, continue on about dance there and art.
So I'm always interested in writing about the non-verbal things, which is part of the point about embodiment. And, my very complicated relationship with food has been thoroughly aired in my memoir. But I've also written food history, and I'm very interested in the relationship between writing and food, whether that's in cookbooks or food writing. So in a way, the interest in writing dance picks up from there. And it's not unlike my interest in prehistory, because prehistory by definition is human experience that's not written down and that doesn't leave language. And dance is a way of making beauty and representing experience that's not written down and doesn't make language. So I'm always drawn to these non-verbal forms of being, and then how you write about them.
Yeah, I mean, at one stage Edith said I was the mind and Lydia is the body, and I thought that was beautiful as well.
Yeah, but she's wrong,
I know,
of course,
because she's 17-year-old. Yeah.
Yes.
One of the other things that happens is Ripeness is very much about journeying. It's kind of just obviously physical and emotional journeying, and you yourself, you've journeyed as a person living and moving from various parts of England to Reykjavik, where you spent, I think it was a year in Reykjavik, to Dublin, where you now live. And I was thinking, because I spent years ago, I spent a lot of time in other countries and lived in places like Holland and also and Italy for a time, and I really enjoyed the way you described Italy in the novel. Did you live there, I wonder, while you were writing this, or did you just rely on research?
I'd had a residency there. That was where I started writing this. I'd actually originally been thinking of setting it in Greece. And then the Italian residency came along and presented itself and was such a lovely setting that I went from there.
So that's in Como, in George Clooney land.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, yeah. No, we were all joking about his helicopter all the time we were there.
And did you see him? Were there any sightings of George? No sightings. Oh.
There were some helicopters. I mean, we can imagine that he was in the passing helicopter. But
these are the nice things that happen, writers, aren't they? Going to Lake Como. Very nice. From Italy to Claire, I was thinking you capture present day Ireland really well with its shifting cultural landscape. It is a kind of emotional sanctuary for Edith, but it's also a place where, and I think you were very upfront and honest about this, where she recognises its limits, especially when it comes to immigrants arriving, being housed in the local hotel, much to the annoyance of the protesting locals. And it causes a rift between Edith. Edith has a great friend, Maeve, who's Irish, but Maeve goes off to the protest and it causes a big rift. But in spite of the proximity of the two islands, and I mean England and Ireland, it is striking how there are very distinct cultural and linguistic differences going on. And I think that you address that very well between UK and Ireland. Did you find your own experience of being English in Ireland? It must have fed into the novel, did it? I mean, it's throughout the novel, isn't it? And I think you're very brave and upfront, and it's good that it's there, I think.
I was nervous. I mean, of course, I'm nervous about it. But I think a novel, if you're not going to do dangerous things in books, I'm not interested in writing them. I mean, it's not a game I want to play for low stakes. So when I'm writing my Irish Times column, I'm much more careful. And also you can't revise that as much. I mean, I've been over this book dozens, if not hundreds of times, refining, and you can't do that with a weekly column. But I was interested in the idea of hereditary guilt. You know, does your passport make you an oppressor? If it does, how can you mitigate that? Are there ways of mitigating that? Should you aspire to mitigate that, or should you simply accept that here and now, this is who you are? If you accept that here and now, this is who you are, can you live well with that? Is it possible to be good while carrying the oppressor's passport and speaking with the oppressor's accent? I say in my English accent. You know, these seem like quite urgent questions, particularly as globally political discourse bifurcates so much. And there's such a tendency to think that everybody is either an oppressor or oppressed, and there are two sides, and we must take a side and then we must stick to it. And it's so obvious. Sometimes that's true, but most of the time it's obviously more complicated than that. I mean, we've seen that in the papers recently here in the debate about the Normans, you know. I found that very interesting. I decided not to weigh in, not for the English woman to have an opinion on that.
There's also Edith's Jewish heritage, and then there's, you know, there's Gunther the German living there as well. So there's a constant kind of awareness of, you know, those the complications arising out of experience and identity and.
For instance, the Ukrainian in the coffee shop, and she is saying, oh, well, my people fled from them, you know, and now there she is in a coffee shop in Clare, and the Ukrainian is giving her cake, which she says it's actually Jewish, isn't it?
Well, for her, but of course, I mean, if you're in Middle Europa, the food will read as Jewish if you're not from Middle Europa, but it's not because Jewish people had their own completely separate cuisine. It's because that's what we imagine as Jewish food. I mean, it's actually European Ashkenazi food. The Sephardic food is different and has different overlaps. So yes, it's interesting that in those complexities, it's also very deliberately set in spring 2023, because of course the events of October 7th happened while I was writing it, and the violence in Gaza happened while I was writing it. And I couldn't let that in because it was happening as I was writing, and it would have changed everything. And it became an elegy for that moment in spring 2023, before Trump was re-elected, before October 7th, where I think that a woman of Edith's generation, and she's 25 years older than me, could still believe in that liberal rules-based world order, which of course was always founded in violence anyway. I mean, the violence was further away and less visible to us, but it's not that it wasn't there. But I was thinking of it partly as an elegy for that generation, which is my parents' generation and my teachers' generation, who came up in post-war hope in most of Europe with the establishment of welfare states, the rise of socialism, that sense I had as a teenager in the 90s that, you know, gradually the entire world was going to embrace liberal social democracy and then we would all be enlightened, which was absurd. But, you know, I was 17. What does that look like from 2023? And then it had to end there. And that's partly the reason for the third person, for the older Edith. I want there to be a gap between the reader and the older Edith. I want there to be tripping stones there so that you don't just think, oh, yes, you know, I embrace her, I'm with her, I see through her eyes. You don't. She's wrong in some ways, and she's rapidly dating, and that's sort of the point that we all do.
All right, that's interesting. And I have to say also as well, you do get a sense from the book, and she says it, that ultimately she sides with the idea, I think, that Ireland is ultimately a country of kindnesses, even though I've mentioned the hotel and all the protests and all that. But that is what Edith feels, doesn't she? That ultimately this is her emotional sanctuary, and for all, you know, her looking at Maeve, her friend, going out to protest, she still loves her and she wants to rectify that, and they do find a way back. And we don't want to give away too much of the plot, but there is another story happening, isn't there, which brings the two women together. So you have women going along, you know, the sisters, you've Lydia and you've Edith, and then you have the friendship, the women and friendship, and they were all beautifully drawn. So I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Peter, what you are bursting to ask about the memoir.
You know, it's a memoir, as you were saying, it's a memoir of, you know, it's an unhappy childhood versus parental neglect. There's a struggle with anorexia, and but also the nature of memoir itself. It's like you've got these competing voices going on. It's like this kind of, oh no you did, oh no you didn't kind of voice, so it's like it's shifting, and the narrator, the narrative is kind of unreliable, and the narrator is kind of deliberately sort of unreliable. You've got this kind of italicized voice going on saying, do you really think that was bad? What about, and it's kind of interesting, but also it's also kind of incidentally about the intensity and ever-presentness of reading. And like a good chunk of it is a forensic analysis of Little Women, Little House on the Prairie, Swallows and Amazons, Jane Eyre, Emma, Villette. And there's a point later on where, the character, the narrator, is sitting on a hospital bed in Dublin, rereading War and Peace. And so obviously kind of reading is a big part of your process. And, life as an academic, teacher of literature, as well as a writer. And I suppose since we're in an MFA program, I'm guessing you'd say that reading is important for a young or continuing writer.
So is breathing and eating, yeah.
That was a long question.
Are you going to say anything else? Yeah, Peter, you spoke more than Sarah.
But also, I suppose the other part of that is did writing that memoir change how you think about the way in which stories get told?
I think the process of writing it changed my thinking about nonfiction. I'm not sure it changed fiction for me more. You hope to evolve from one book to another anyway. I see it partly as I was going to say the end, but who knows? I'm not going to go that far. The next stage in an experiment with choral prose, an ongoing experiment with choral prose, which I'm doing in Summerwater, where I have 12 characters and we move between them. And I also did my favourite book that sells least well is Science for Lost Children, which also goes backwards and forwards between two characters. And that felt like I don't do this, so I don't know, but it felt like conducting two symphony orchestras at once. It was kind of, how do you keep a bit of percussion going over there while you bring the melody up over here? And of course, in writing, you can never actually do that. You can only have one word at a time. It moves in lines. You can do whatever you like with narrative time, but sentences go from the beginning to the end, and then another sentence goes from the beginning to the end. You can't have two things happening at once. So how close can you get to having two things happening at once? And that's one of the things that's going on in my Good White Wolf, where there are almost two things happening at once, because there's someone telling a story and there's another voice saying...
Undercutting it, kind of.
Not only undercutting it, but questioning the motivation. Not only that's not true, that didn't happen, but I know why you're pretending that did happen. I see through you. I can see what you're doing there. So it's an experiment in plurality, choral prose, and also representing cognitive impairment.
Were you worried about that it affected the main narrative, or that people wouldn't trust what was being said because of the constant undercutting at the side?
I didn't really mind if they trusted it or not. It's a book about an experience of dissolution, both disillusion and dissolution. And it's about narrative collapse. And I was sick enough that there was no linear narrative and there was not really an interior monologue or an authorial voice. And that's not often represented. When people write about that kind of thing, it tends to be recollected in tranquility with a nice ending about, and then we lived happily ever after. And I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in the howl. I was interested in how you might bend narrative prose to accommodate an experience that is not narrative and is not presenting itself in prose. So in a way, it's part of the same experiment as the ballet, though in a much darker form. How close can you make a chaotic, difficult, fragmented experience come to the structures of sentences and paragraphs?
So great to hear you talking, isn't it, Peter? Yeah, and we've so enjoyed reading your books. From the memoir, can we go back to Ripeness again? And I was wondering, would you read a piece maybe towards the end of the book? Yeah, you've got a piece that you'd love to read, isn't that it, Sarah? Yeah.
I have, yeah. I like this bit. So this is 73-year-old Edith. It's usually quite dangerous to read from the end of a book because you spoil things. But in this occasion, she's just going for a walk. And she's in the Burren, which is my favourite place in the world.
Yeah, it's perfectly fine. Off you go.
It's a bright day. Spring taking hold in the twigs of rowan and hazel and in the cups and cracks of the rocks. It's the season to look for the invisible white flower, and warm enough to stop moving and pay attention. gentle wind, a scattering of high cloud, a good growing day. Bird song, and still in those precious weeks when the lamb's call is met by their mother's response, when the calves potter and nose beside the cows. Her shadow lopes beside her, sun on her back, in her hair, benediction. She stops at the place where she and Maeve once convinced each other they'd seen the invisible flower, crouches and peers. Tiny gardens, she thinks, in the cracks and cups of the rock, but they're not gardens, not cultivated. Just the world making itself despite everything. Roots thin as hair, leaves small as eyelashes, but there they are, photosynthesizing, sunlight into energy. And yes, insects, ants, something smaller than ants. And there are ticks here, that's why she sits on the rock and never in the grass. She cranes forward. A couple of the cups hold last night's rain still, ponds the size of her curled hand mirroring the sky. She holds her spread fingers between the sun and the water. Eclipse. There's a disturbance in the nearest pool, a prickle in the surface tension. She leans over, darkening the water. A blonde moth, small as all creatures here are, has made a mistake. Its legs are still paddling, but the wings are sealed to the water's surface. As flies to wanton boys, she thinks, one does not need to be that kind of god. She looks for a leaf, some form of rescue craft suited to the delicacy of the job, but nothing so big grows near here. One finger would displace half the pond, and she's afraid that the wet wing would stick to her skin. She feels in the pocket of her jacket and finds a shopping list written on the torn-off flap of an envelope, ideally stiff and thin. Yogurt, query fish, coffee, toothpaste. The question mark means if you find fish that is both sustainable and affordable, buy it, as if she didn't know that such a thing no longer exists. She folds the paper to make a shelf for the moth, to minimize the scale of intervention, squats low, takes a deep breath and slowly scoops. The wings stick to the paper, but it's glossy, probably around something better than a bill. Some of her friends still send Christmas cards, at least a little water resistant. A bird shadow flickers over them, her and the blonde moth, and above a raven calls. What have we here? It's narrating to its sky audience. A woman playing God? She sits back carefully, holding the moth on its paper stretcher in the sun to dry. Old fool, she murmurs to herself. Either way it will be food for birds. But aren't we all, in the end, food for birds, food for worms for birds? The moth doesn't move, still doesn't move. She doesn't want to leave the paper here, the kind that takes forever, probably more time than we have, to decompose. And taking the moth along on her walk seems wrong, as if it should be left where it was found, as if she should limit her intervention to heroic measures. She tilts her face to the sun, waiting for resurrection. She has time, still some time, enough to wait.
Oh, thank you, Sarah, for that. And actually, it's nice to hear. It's lovely to hear that. And I was just thinking there, when you said the Burn is your favourite place, and we were talking about the women in this book, Ripeness, but wasn't it women who first brought you to the Burn? It wasn't by total accident. I read somewhere you describing this, and it's quite incredible, really, isn't it? What happened?
I was speaking at the Ennis Book Club Festival in March 2020. The date is relevant. And there was a bit of a wobble about should it go ahead, should it not go ahead, and they decided to go ahead. It was March 19th, I think. And on the last day of the festival, I gave my talk and then I was signing books. And a woman in the signing queue said, have you been to the Burren? Having read your books, I think you'd absolutely love it. And I said, no, I've always really wanted to. I think I would too. And she said, well, my friend and I go there every Sunday afternoon together. We have done for years. Would you like to come too? And the festival organizer was standing behind me and I kind of looked at her and she said, well, if you get Sarah back to the airport by 6, then yes, I suppose so. So I went off in a car with these two women I'd never met before. And we had a fantastic adventure in the Burren. It was amazing. The bit I haven't said otherwise is that it turned out that various bits of the Burren were flooded and there were lanes we couldn't get through. And I was going to be on time for my plane, and then it was going to be a bit tight. And then it was going to be really, really, really tight. And then they had to drive very fast through mysteriously empty roads to get me to Shannon.
These women who didn't even know you.
I know. It was really nice of them. And I kept saying, no, you don't have to take me to the airport. Really, it's fine. But it was perfectly obvious that they did, because there was no alternative. And we screeched up outside the airport with 40 minutes to go before takeoff. And I was thinking, this isn't going to work. And I walked in and there was nobody there. There wasn't even anyone at passport control. I just walked quite fast through the entire airport to my gate, where I boarded a plane. I mean, it wasn't a huge plane. It was flying from Shannon to Birmingham, but there must have been 100 empty seats and 4 people on board. Thinking, this is very weird. I've never had this kind of experience. What's going on here? Landed in Birmingham, where also anybody could have walked into Britain at that point. There was no one on passport control. There was no one at the airport. Breezed through the whole thing. Discovered that there were no trains going from Birmingham Airport anymore. So that was a bit of a problem. And then that was the end of that.
Yeah, very strange. Another novel there. But what was good about that is those women actually became your friends.
They're still my closest friends, yeah.
Okay, well, there you go. But I just want to say thank you so much. It was great to hear Sarah there reading from her new novel, Ripeness, talking to us about it. It's just out from Picador. But before you go, listening to you read that beautiful natural bit where you was so astute, really, your detail of nature there in the piece that you read there, it's connected, isn't it, with the Toaster Challenge. You were not allowed to leave without us trying this with you, Sarah, where you're going to talk about a book that you love for as long as it takes to make a slice of toast. Now, Peter has something to say about this.
Okay, so the bread is done. 1, 2, 3. Off you.
Okay, yeah. I like my toast dark. So the book I really love is Dorothy Wordsworth's Grasmere Journals. She is the sister of William Wordsworth. And when I first encountered her, it was this kind of source material for his poems, because a lot of the images that appear in his poems are originally in her journals. And then as I read them more closely, I saw how much attention she pays to the work of care. And they were dismissed for a long time as being just books about cooking and cleaning, and then there's a little bit about flowers. Isn't that the essence of life? I mean, there is no poetry without cooking and cleaning. There are no flowers if you don't feed the body so that it can move around and enjoy the flowers and plant the flowers. So now I find her interest in domestic work absolutely fundamental to the whole Grasmere project, where the most famous outcome is William's poetry. But I don't think she thought of it as William's poetry. I think they both thought of it as their poetry. And I think the journals really show you that for her, the making of the apple pie is also the making of the poem. And also she's finding a balance between the work of care and her own liberation. When she wants to go for a walk, she goes for a walk. When she wants to climb a mountain, she climbs a mountain, regardless of rain, regardless of people saying, oh, well, it's not really safe for a woman to be out there on her own, which they did in the 18th century, at least as much as they do now. And when she's tired, she rests. And when she has a headache, she goes to bed. And when she's hungry, she cooks something and eats it. So for me, that rhythm that she finds between autonomous, independent outdoor life, the work of reading and writing, and the work of care and getting bodies through the day is absolutely fundamental to any decent literary project.
Thank you. No, thank you. No, the toast is fine. It's nice and crispy because it is extraordinary, and I do recommend it. This is the one I had. It's kind of like it's Penguin. Dorothy William Wordsworth Home at Grasmere, and it has a journal and it has his poems in it as well. And sometimes, because she's always copying out his poems, or she's entertaining Coleridge, but you realise as well, because like the two, like they're in Dove Cottage when she's writing this, and you know, they're orphans. They've come together. This is their first kind of proper household, and so all of that kind of domestic care is hugely important to both of them. And she's always out, and like the observing eye is extraordinary. I mean, I know the most obvious one is the daffodils one, where she talks about the big belt of daffodils among the mossy stones and all of that. And then you go and you read William's poem and you say, God, that's exactly, you know, he takes it from that.
But as you said, Sarah, when we were chatting earlier, it's not a question of stealing. So many people think it's robbing, and you know that Wordsworth was there, big mean Wordsworth came and rifled his way through her journals. But no, it was really kind of a collaboration.
Absolutely. And also they're there together. I mean, the idea that he's stealing her work suggests that she went and looked at the daffodils and wrote a description, and then he came and stole the description from her page. But actually they're walking together. I mean, the lie is the wandering lonely as a cloud. Not that clouds do tend to wander in a very lonely way, but there were two of them and there was Mrs. Clarkson, except that she goes home because her stockings are wet.
Yeah, these lovely details, beautiful details.
It's great. But we have no idea who first came up with those similes, because there they are walking along together looking at the daffodils. They write it down in different ways at different times. But I honestly don't think either of them would care about whose name is on the thing. Yeah. I mean, put his name on the pie and put her name on the poem. It's fine. It doesn't make any difference.
And it was a great book, because Peter and I have been really enjoying grabbing it off each other. But it was nice when you wrote to me and you said it has been an old friend to you over the years.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us why? Why is it so important to you? It's a lovely way to describe a book, I think, really.
Thank you. I've known Wordsworth's poetry since I was a child. My grandmother got a scholarship to read English at university, and then her father wouldn't let her go. But she always loved poetry, and she liked me to learn poems and say them to her, which I did, in the days when it was very easy to learn a poem, and I, of course, remember them all my life. She loved Wordsworth, so I knew those poems from when I can remember. And then when I was studying Wordsworth at university, I encountered Dorothy's journals and immediately came at them in a kind of second wave feminist. Well, she is really originating this and he's stealing it. And it's part of this pattern where men steal women's work. And also, of course, I'm not interested in all the bits about how to make an apple pie, because that's beneath us in our, disembodied, pure poetic state. And then I had a baby while I was an Oxford academic, really not on at the time. There I was going around being all kind of bodily and fertile and having babies and making milk and things in the High Table and in the SCR. And, really, really not on. And I came back to those books then while having a baby, and thought this is actually a radically different and necessary way of thinking about care and writing. It's a rejection of that Cartesian disembodiment. She's insisting that the work of embodiment and the work of cooking and the work of care are not separable from the work of reading and writing and the work of thinking and ideas. And it was quite tough, those first few years of motherhood in academia. I was not in supportive environments, but her writing was one of the paths that I held on to, one of the things that gave me faith that there would be a way of combining those kinds of work. And of course there has been.
Well, I think we're going to end, sadly, our conversation today, but thank you so much, Sarah. And as usual, details of all the books will be available on www.booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. So
thank you. I mean, if people want to ask questions or anything, we can do that as well.
Thank you. You talked a little bit about, in particular, My Good Bright Wolf, talking about the fragmented episode and kind of playing with narrative. And I wanted, in several of your books, you changed the person and point of view. And in particular, My Good Bright Wolf, you changed the point of view, but just sustaining the second person point of view seems like it'd be a challenge. So I didn't know if you could talk a little bit about that.
I was really playing with it. I mean, it was a relatively late decision in drafting, and then I rewrote it all that way, having played about with both first and third person. It lets those voices play. It opens up a space for the interrupting voice. And also, as soon as you use the second or third person, you've conjured into being someone else, right? Because there's a speaker. And you can go full George Eliot and have a very moralizing, omniscient narrator, which I'm kind of playing with it at the moment. I'm quite interested in that figure. But even if you don't do that, as soon as you're not using the first person, there's someone else in the room, there's someone telling the story. And that's a bit of a safety net for both the author and the reader of that book. There's clearly somebody addressing the you. There is, although it's a book about chaos and breakdown, written from the depths of chaos and breakdown, that just gives everybody a little bit of breathing space.
I was thinking about two things when you were talking. One was how novelists make decisions about what to look at. For instance, when you're talking about the demonstrators who turn up to the hotel, so for every one of them, there are 100 people who don't. But we're deciding that I'm not saying you in that novel, but always we decide on what we will figure. Now, okay, with that in the background, the one thing that I was really fascinated by what you said today was about the thing about at a certain age, she has belonged to the generation in which that war was over. But then I was thinking, I think every generation lies about the violence that they have seen. And they cover it up for their children's sake a lot of the time, because they think the only way for us to move forward now in the human way that we wish to do without that awfulness is to cover this up. But okay, so the question is the decisions.
I think, yeah, that's unsurprisingly a really interesting and subtle question. And I think that idea about the stage in life where you tell the stories of violence is important. A lot of the Holocaust survivors didn't speak about it until their 60s and 70s. And there were a lot of children of survivors who grew up hearing nothing about it and then suddenly hearing about it, presumably when it felt a bit safer to tell the story or when it felt necessary to tell it, so it got passed on. And this book is very interested in intergenerational trauma and exile and war. And I was thinking when you were speaking, of course, the war is never over. No war is ever over. It echoes on through us, through the survivors, through the descendants of the survivors. The war doesn't stop. But it transmutes probably from generation to generation. And I'm interested in that transmutation. So I think the question about generations and age is really, it's about when do we hold back and when do we tell? And how does what we don't tell come through? And maybe part of the work of the novelist is not to tell what's repressed, but to open ways of imagining or representing what's repressed, I think.
Can I say, because Evelyn, there's a phrase that you use that's almost exactly what Evelyn was saying, and it's like that Edith, I think, says, you can't see the violence of your own moment. You can't hear what you and your friends and children consider unspeakable.
And I was thinking there about how things change, what seems to, a silly example is, do you remember how they used to be smoking at the back of planes? Absurd. What was anybody thinking? But if you live yes, yeah. If you live a few decades, the things that seemed fine seem totally unacceptable. And then you can either say, well, never did us any harm, well, back in my day it was fine. Or you can think, wow, we really couldn't see that harm. But then you have to follow that up with, I wonder what harm we can't see at the moment that will be evident in 20 or 30 or 40 years. And Edith's thinking about that here a bit in relation to issues of sex and violence and consent, where I'm old enough to think that experiences that I and my friends, and certainly my mother and her friends, took as completely normal, really shouldn't have been, really weren't okay. But then how do you navigate that change across decades? Do you look back on your own younger experiences and think that was terrible? Sometimes you do. But if it didn't seem terrible to you in that moment, all the other people involved, how much retrospective... do you see what I mean? And I don't have an answer, and I'm not suggesting that anything is okay.
I've left it to last, Sarah, because I don't intrude. And if you don't want to furnish an answer, it's okay. But the memoir, My Good Bright Wolf, it does illustrate the point. What you go through is something you go through, you don't get over, you go through it. There was a real sense of the care in Ireland just about keeping you alive, but you had to manage a lot of that yourself. And really you had to resort to some wisdom from outside to help, And I was just wondering, was there something that was said to you then that wasn't furnished by anyone here that sustained you and got you to where you are now, back working and in another relationship with that experience?
I think being well is always a practice, not an event. Yeah, and I think all of us practice it better or worse from time to time. And that was a worse time and now it's a better time. But I'd see it as an iteration, a bodily practice, an artistic practice, rather than a gift or an event, if that makes sense.
So will we say, we'll give a big clap, I think, definitely, to Sarah Mott. That's the teacher in me. Sarah's also, you love teaching, don't you? So in Ireland, we always have the big claps and it makes us all feel very happy. But it was really great to listen to Sarah today. And actually, it covered a lot of her writing as well. Thank you, Brian, so much for that introduction. And thank you so much for answering all our questions and talking to us.
Thank you both very much. That's great.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley and I have Peter Serra here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.